Hello everybody, thanks for tuning in. This is another Western Tabletop Battle Report, and in this particular episode I'm going to be doing Blood Red Skies as a solo scenario. It's a system that's got several tutorials online, so I'm not going to skip over I'm not going to do the how to play. I'm just going to go straight into the scenario and just play it out and roll some dice. It's a bit late here, which is why I've got the big bright light on, a bit cold, so I've got gloves and everything, but don't let that distract you when I'm moving things around the table. And yeah, I'll try this out and let us know what you think. All right. Okay, so I have a gaming mat down with some paper clouds that have been just simply roughly measured and cut out and thrown on the table. The scenario mission is we have a cruiser, American cruiser, that is meant to represent the edges of the American fleet, being patrolled by some Grumman F4Fs, I think they are, Wildcats. Time frame is approximately 1940. They're on patrol, coming back from the fleet, and who will be strafing over to attack them will be 4 Japanese Kate bombers, so torpedo bombers, single engine, supported by Japanese Zeros. So we've got 2 in this element and we have 3 in this element. And the main objective is get those torpedo bombers over to that fleet to cause casualties. So I have created a, let's call it a random results table for whether the torpedoes successfully hit or not, how much damage they do, and they need to accumulate a certain amount of damage on the fleet in order to secure victory. Obviously, the Wildcats will be attempting to drive them off. So the points, quite simply, will be if they secure the number of hits required with boom counters on the fleet, the Japanese will win regardless of casualties. But the Wildcats are aiming to destroy all 4 of the Kate bombers, and the Japanese will be trying to get the bombers through to safety to drop off the torpedoes. That's the plan. There is 1 Wildcat in reserve, and I will bring that on as the Japanese get closer as a reinforcement. The premise behind that is, as these guys are on patrol coming back, they have not detected the Japanese on radar yet. And so when they do that with a random roll that I've sort of put in place, that reinforcement Wildcat is essentially all that is left to scramble from the fleet and is sent out as a carrier-borne aircraft to try and give some last final stand damage. As you can see, I am playing on a 6x4 table, which is really 2 typical Blood Red Skies battlefields combined. But because I'm running in and using a radar detection mechanic, the extra space is actually going to work out okay. So as I go through, I'll take some, I'll move things, I'll do turn summaries, and rather than unit by unit, and we'll see what happens. There is potentially a respawn mechanic that I will add in if either the bombers are killed too quickly or the Wildcats are killed too quickly to scramble more fighters, because it's not going to be fun if it's either an easy run or an insanely hard run. All right, let's see how we go. Okay, so turn 1 was quite straightforward. The Japanese are sorting out an approach. The Kates move directly forward for each of their activations. You can see the Zero starting to form up on the flank and the other element coming in a little bit further. They didn't take full use of all their movement necessarily. And then I come over to the Wildcats. Now, the Wildcats, because they're essentially on patrol, I'm actually randomizing how they move and what actions they take. So this one here, for example, he just bumped forward 3 inches. This one was able to move 6 but kept the same heading. This one moved 6 and was able to change heading slightly towards the left, so he's pivoted a bit more. And then this one moved 8 but had to pivot to the right. So they've maintained their advantage on the right flank of each element, but they'll start to break up and disperse a little bit more as they're coming back from their program patrols. So they're going off to their relevant carrier space or taking up holding patterns or whatever. And they did not, with any range, they did not detect the Japanese incoming on the clouds there. So we may have a couple of turns where they where we're all just positioning, and these escorts end up in a really odd position. But that will sort of make it more fun and harder for them to focus fire on the Kates straight away. So should end up in a massive scramble in the middle before getting to the ship, which is in the fleet, which is exactly what I want. So on to turn 2. Okay, we have a bit more movement. This is actually turn 2 and turn 3 combined, so that's why there's such a big leap from where they were. We've got that forward Japanese element that moved in, burnt their advantage to get some extra movement ahead. This element is still advantaged, ready to protect those Kate bombers. And we're getting closer. The maximum radar range has been reached, and so now radar was quite ineffective. It existed, but it's certainly not anything like what they were going to have towards the end of the war. So it's not super efficient with the detection of the aircraft. However, they're certainly going to get some sweeps a bit clearer now. So these two air Wildcats are moving in randomized patrols the right direction. And these two are just squabbling amongst themselves. So as soon as the radar goes off for one of them, they will radio to all aircraft within 12 inches. And so that should pick up all the elements pretty quickly. And then these planes will operate as normal as opposed to randomized scouts. But yes, the Japanese are still coming in, and the defense is still milling around. Well, I know I was saying that the radar was ineffective, but the front leading Zeros in that two-wing element got just within range of this pilot, and he maxed out his rolls and succeeded in locating the enemy on his radar. And so then he radioed the position to all the Wildcats who were within 12, which was all of them. Put in a request to scramble reinforcements, which will be the last Wildcat. That will take a turn to arrive, to take effect, so it won't come in on this turn. It'll come on the turn after, and it'll fly on from the fleet base onto the board. And so we will have a 5 versus 5 scrum, which is maybe not what the Japanese want. If the Hellcats can survive and just push through and hit those Kates. But of course, if they're focusing on the Kates, then the Wildcats will get shot to ribbons by the Zeros. So yes, we'll see how many can get through. The Kates are very slow, only moving at about 5 inches a turn right now for the scenario. So they'll move a bit quicker when they engage in their dive bomb attack on the fleet token. But they're going to take a while to get there at 5 inches a turn because they can't climb any other advantage. And but they are fairly hard to stop. So they will just keep on going until they're destroyed. But okay, on to the next turn. And so this is actually into turn 5, and we have engagement. So the two sets of elements on each side are starting to skirmish. There's been a lot of outmaneuvering and trying to take people off advantage and getting into the turns to burn advantage to swing around. The Kates are still coming closer, but the Zeros, interestingly enough, actually from 1940 have a lower attack value, which means that the Wildcats are actually got better guns, but they really are not agile at all. So they get outmaneuvered very easily. And so the pilot skill 4 Zero back here, that's a real threat to the Wildcats, even though they're quite robust. And so they have robust as the trait, and so they'll, I think it's ignore the first sort of damage hit that takes them out. But at the moment, few gunshots back and forth, but not a whole lot, so they'll have to dogfight. And those bombers are getting ever closer to the fleet. Okay, we'll pick this up in turn 6. And here we go, that's the end of another turn. So let's just explain what's happening here as the fighters are starting to dogfight, starting to get engaged, and we've got some interaction with the bombers and reserves. So the first thing is this turn, the Wildcat reserve came on. And so he's moved in a position for advantage, getting ready to start diving and probably attacking one of the bomber strafes given the mission. Another one in advantage here, just positioning. And we have the middle of the table is now starting to scrum with the Japanese Zeros now engaged with the Wildcats. The first couple of passes, they actually, both the Japanese and the Americans, both had one hit each, so they took a boom chit on the squadrons. The squadrons will still evacuate, I think, given the statistics, that'll be able to be okay. They're not likely to shoot each other necessarily because they'll be focused on the bombers. So a couple of zeros here in advantage, and one got outmaneuvered for disadvantage. So that dynamic will be interesting to see on the table. But more interesting is the two Wildcats zooming in on the Kates, and we had one of the Kates was outmaneuvered, and so now is disadvantaged, even though they had entered the cloud just prior to that, which will open up the avenue for an attack in the way that the activations will work. So that could be devastating. They might lose a bomber straight away, and those two largely unmolested so far. But a long way to go. 5 inches a turn is not long. There's a bit of a fight over, exactly how this will go. So next turn will be interesting. I'll come back with another summary. Well, that was an interesting turn. So coming into the table, obviously the scrum dogfight in the middle continues. You can see everyone putting down their markers now. The Wildcat Reserve is still coming in, going to tangle with those two bombers when they get a touch closer. We've got one of the zeros that's sort of coming around the side in advantage. But in here, there's been a lot of action. So the Wildcats have had their first strafe attacks onto the bombers, and they actually managed to get one of the hits there, but couldn't take the bomber down. So those bombers have proceeded through the clouds and are continuing on course. But we have lots of aircraft that are in states of disadvantage across the way as they went and did their attacks and were outmaneuvered and moved around. And unfortunately, one of the zeros was taken out. So was put into disadvantage and then was killed off by a Wildcat, which was then in turn put into disadvantage from one of the other zeros swinging by. So the zeros are typically a bit more vulnerable because they don't have the same firepower as the Wildcats historically. So it's only a rating of a 2 to a 1, but when you stack that with pilot skill, that can actually be quite a difference. So it'd be interesting to see just how quickly the zeros fold if they do, and whether they can take out any of the robust Wildcats, which are proving stubborn to say the least. As the bombers, of course, advance, their rear tail guns are going to be able to open up their rear arc of fire, and that gives them a +1 firepower. So they'll all suddenly start throwing 4 dice at rear attacks for any tailing aircraft, which makes them a little bit nastier to deal with because they're actually a front attack of 0. But this is, I forget what track of the turn that I'm actually up to, but we are now in the second half of the game with those bombers getting ever closer. So it's probably, with the bombers themselves, they're not actually allowed to climb for advantage to line up an attack run until sort of the last 12 inches. So they'll get a sweeping attack on that last run, but otherwise they are coasting. And so that's why I haven't pushed their advantage levels. They're just running through. The Japanese have taken 4 boom chits +1 on the bombers, and there are 2 on the Wildcats. Obviously, those squadrons, I'm not folding them, as I realized if I did that, I was going to have to respawn them way too many times. So I'll simply keep a track of how many are hurt or how many hits are encountered. But definitely when the aircraft are destroyed, they will be going and disappearing. So, all right, it's just getting to over the halfway point, and let's see how many torpedoes we can get onto that carrier group. Okay, the next turn is now done. So a couple of things have happened here. So we can see a couple of the Zeros have done 180s as they burned their advantage to reposition, and that actually resulted in a couple of hits on the Wildcats. Did not bring any of the Wildcats down, however, they are all still flying. The rear guns of the bombers have been active and have been adding some boom chits themselves. The Wildcats only ended up getting one additional boom token this time round. So we are 4 boom tokens each for both of the fighter squadrons and 2 on the bomber squadron. Now, despite the effort of 4 Wildcats to bring down one of those bombers, it survived unscathed and just simply moved out of range, moved out of the cloud cover, and climbed for advantage back to a neutral state. So even though I'm not doing anything with the bombers, surprisingly hard to keep them in check. So we've got one advantage Wildcat over here and one advantage Wildcat at the back there on the other bomber squadron. So there will probably be some attacks coming through, but all the Zeros are back in neutral as well, so they'll start being able to chase the Wildcats to give the Kates room as we are closing in on the fleet. I've put a set of markers just down here at that 12-inch mark so that they'll be able to use their advantage in what will be their, essentially they'll climb for advantage to at least be at neutral, and then they will perform an attack against those that the fleet where they're in range. And each torpedo, they'll have 1 per aircraft, and as many as we can get through. There's a total that we're going to have to reach, and I won't reveal that until the end. But yeah, the Wildcats need to focus on those bombers. They're starting to get a bit close. Well, that will teach me for being, let's say, too optimistic. So the carnage that happened this turn, obviously the scrum in the middle and the melee is still going with the dogfight. 2 of the bombers, however, are missing. They were tailed in. One was simply a higher pilot skill and so got a critical hit, and the other one tailed, forced it down, just didn't roll enough hits, but was put disadvantaged in the process. But 2 of the Kates gone, so now there's only 2 bombers coming in on the fleet, halved the risk. Over here was a little bit different, so we've got another F4F Grumman, or Grumman F4F, that's gone for advantage coming out of the cloud, chasing probably that last bomber. And then over here, plucky, inexperienced Mr. Number 2 took out a Grumman F4F. So we have the first American casualty, and the current count of boom, or boom chits, as they call them, or damage tokens. There are 6 on the American side. There's 4 on the Zero escorts and 4 on the Kates. So that is quite, it's a little bit closer than what I was expecting. The Kates have taken a lot of fire, and then just their luck has run out this last 2 turns. And like the Grumman, for example, here, he probably should have survived. His defense, it was 2 hits, but that still, it only reduced his defense to 8 dice. And he successfully missed a 6 on 8 dice, and therefore, after being put at disadvantage, was destroyed. So I'll clear off those blast markers in a moment, but it looks like maybe 2 turns the bombers will be destroyed, given how that went, unless the Zeros can rally and focus fire on some of those Wildcats. I'll be back with the next turn. The desperate chase is on. So the 2 bombers have started their ascent into what essentially will be their dive to cross over these markers. So they're looking at almost a 12-inch move, which will cross them over into attack threshold. In order for them to attack, they have to be in at least a neutral state, and they need to get within 1 move of the fleet. And then we will simply roll for how many boom chit tokens they generate per torpedo, and if that reaches the total that they need for the impact on the fleet, they are good to go. Now, obviously, it's based on the overall averages of expecting 2 were going to get destroyed. So this is about the perfect scenario it could have possibly been. There is a desperate chase of the Wildcats trying to catch up with them as they've shot past and as the escorts have done their job, delaying and holding. Importantly, these two Wildcats here, both were forced to disadvantage, and so they weren't able to climb for advantage. He's actually straight. They weren't able to climb for advantage. They had to go back to neutral, which means that essentially they can't do any sort of diving, tailing shenanigans straight away on these advantage flyers because they're going to move first, which is very important. Very important. And so it's not that a fighter wouldn't normally be able to outrun a bomber, but it's more that the bombers are starting their final approach. They've sort of broken free of the dogfight and are looking to deliver a killing blow. For the sake of the scenario, I'm not including anti-aircraft fire from the fleet because, well, it'd probably demolish 2 bombers. So the Zeros have done okay. They've only lost 1 of their number. But when I come to what I've been recording on the side here, number of hits, that was a rough round for the Americans. They went from they almost doubled, going from almost 5 to 10 for no increase at all on the Japanese side. So that was quite impressive. Okay, let's see what happens. The turns are getting quicker as we are running out of aircraft and critical actions become apparent. So the 2 bombers, with their advantage, sort of pushed right up, and both of them attempted to climb for advantages again. And the only reason that this one is in disadvantage is because a Wildcat shot through the cloud. So when you go through a cloud, you leave it in neutral. So he burnt advantage to do a dive, came out neutral, got tailing on the angle and the range, and so the Kate was forced into disadvantage immediately, and then he opened fire. Unfortunately for him, he completely missed, and the rear guns hit him, so he successfully got another boom chit for the Americans. However, he did evade and therefore was not forced into disadvantage. But it does mean that this bomber is he's going to get shot at least once, I suspect, before he gets a run on the fleet. This one, however, is probably a bit different. These 2 are just regrouping. Over this side of the table, we got some chasing and tailing that will happen. So the only reason that this isn't tailing is because he moved first, jumped ahead, and went to disadvantage as part of a pivot to outmaneuver him because he was in advantage, which would have snookered the patterned bomber over there. So that was successfully passed. And then we killed another American Wildcat with the Japanese Zero pilot skill 4, just absolutely ravaging. He got a critical hit, reduced the evasions, and just took him out. And then pilot number 2, upcoming Japanese ace, is getting in as close as he can, but it may not be enough. It looks like the Wildcats are going to get a pass at least 1, potentially 2 of the bombers, and we will see how we can go. I will tell you at this point that the magic number of torpedoes hits that need to go through was only ever 6. And each torpedo rolling a d6, that means 1 torpedo on a outside chance will be able to impact the destroyer fleet, or the carrier fleet, sorry. That particular 1 boat, that is. If 2 go through, obviously the chances are better. 1 can still do it. But yeah, if 4 had gone in, it would have been fairly catastrophic. But I'll roll that out, and when I get to launching the torpedo, if I get to launching the torpedo, I'll actually probably do that on camera, and we'll see how we can go. But not a bad skirmish so far. Okay, so as I assess the board, this bomber is actually the first aircraft to go, and so we will have a torpedo launch. So he will drop his advantage into neutral, which gets him the extra inch or so past his 5 to reach the target ship, and he will quite simply, in my head, this is all that's happening. He runs to there. We grab a dice. His torpedoes are successfully launched. I'm ignoring duds. I'm ignoring any of the other things that happen. 5 points worth of damage. Okay, so if that bomber, because this one will now just fly off and recircle out of screen, and it'll fly back to the land base. But if that bomber, that Cape bomber, now can successfully reach this ship to launch a torpedo, that will be it. That will be game. So can the American Wildcats chase it down in time? Let's see what happens. Okay, and as you can see, the bomber that needs to hit is still alive. So where we've ended up towards the very last turns of the game here is this bomber's back in neutral but didn't have movement to also get to the target, so could not deliver a torpedo in this turn. There is a very remote possibility that this Grumman F4 here, this one, can chase him down, force him to be tailed, force him into disadvantage, and therefore he cannot complete an attack on the target, which would mean that the Americans win. But in order for that to happen, the Grumman has to survive probably 2 attacks from these zeros, as they are faster than he is. So I suspect that this one coming out of the cloud is probably going to be able to get into a tailing position, which will force him into disadvantage, which will mean that he won't be able to shoot at the bomber, but he might be able to position himself because you can't tail someone if you're disadvantaged. So if he gets pushed into disadvantage, then he can't hurt this one at all, which means as long as this one can get to a tailing position, this is a foregone conclusion, and this will deliver 1 point of damage to sink the battleships. So what I'm going to do is just measure out the angles, make sure that this one can reach a tailing position, because it will get to activate first, and if it can, it's a foregone conclusion. And so it's basically the Japanese mopping up on some potential kills on the Wildcats, which they had a few kills and hits that turn, so we're up to 13 hits on the Wildcats against 10. Only, and as you can see, they're focusing on the bombers, only 6 hits on the bombers. The bombers have become really resilient, which was very interesting because they've only got an agility of 1, but any plane that's attacked on the side gets to use its higher value for its movement in its defense, and typically that has actually been quite substantial. Like, so when you're trying to go past a bomber, if you're caught on an angle, they just get a straight +5, and then the pilot's kill of 3. So 8 dice to defend is actually pretty good. And it doesn't help that you're getting shot by rear guns at the same time, putting you into disadvantage. But I'll do the measurements, but I think that we are pretty much there. Yep, so I just measured it out. That 0 that's on the cloud is easily within 7 inches and a pivot to force tailing as a condition, and so he would become disadvantaged, which means he can't chase this one. He will then go through and resolve, and just for the sake of interest, he rolls a 6, and let's just say that we've killed an additional one as well. So a total of 11 points of damage, needing the 6 to get through for the 1 bomber. Pretty good skirmish, pretty fun. Elapsed time, probably like even on the bigger boards, wasn't actually that long, and the turns really started to sort of become 5-minute interchanges as you got going. Lots of fun, a really quick system, very little army list writing, things like that. And this scenario is one that I expect that I can run at one of the game clubs very, very soon. All right, thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll catch you next time.